Boris Johnson told Laura Kuenssberg last night. So we have now an interview that he has given where he has set out in slightly more detail what he thinks his government, if he takes over, will do in the first few days and weeks. What do you make of what you heard from him?
Well, it was slightly more detailed, but nowhere near enough. He's putting a lot of hopes on the fact that the EU thinks a political event has taken place and that will shift their position. There's still nothing there that convinces me that he can renegotiate the backstop in a way that Theresa May failed to do so. The other interesting thing was the sort of hint in his words that the Irish backstop could be a model for, the Irish border can be a model for other borders. And I think, quite frankly, that would just make eyes roll in the other 27, because if that was a sort of play to sort of get a bit more flexibility at Calais and at Dover, it's just not going to succeed because the EU doesn't work like that and is rules-based. So there's a long way to go. I mean, I comfort myself slightly with this leadership election with the way in which, if you remember the US election, when President Trump, when asked a question during the general about something he said in the primary, he said, that was the primary. You've got to say stuff like that in the primary.
Yeah.
And I do wonder a bit whether we're not going to find ourselves in a situation like that when whoever gets into number 10 is faced with reality.
He talked about an implementation period, and he seemed to be suggesting that it was an implementation period for a deal that is a different deal to the one that he's not going to accept, if you see what I mean. So at the moment, there isn't an implementation period, but he seems to think there genuinely could be, because that's very important, obviously, to this industry.
If we don't sign the withdrawal agreement, there will be no implementation period. It's I mean, the only way you get that period is if you sign up to a withdrawal agreement. There is no legal way the EU can give us something that looks like transition absent something signed under the Article 50 process.
So it is genuinely impossible to have a period of grace, to have a period where things can be frozen, which is what he seemed to be suggesting, absent that agreement that we already have in front of us.
Yeah, or some version thereof. There has to be an Article 50 agreement for there to be any kind of transition. If there isn't, then we basically become what the EU likes to call a third country, and all the tariffs and checks apply.
Yeah. But what about the idea, and you hear this from people like Ian Duncan Smith, that what you actually do is go for an agreement that isn't part of the Article 50 process. You go for an agreement that is part of the broader WTO GATT rules, and under that you have an agreement which you could do, and I think they've actually said this in terms, on the back of an envelope, and with that agreement to agree in the future, you can then freeze tariffs under GATT 24, this thing we've been talking about forever. I mean, is any of that, in your view, feasible?
No. Quite simply because on the day we leave, we become a third country. The European Union has made it abundantly clear that if we leave without a withdrawal agreement, they will of course be happy to talk to us, but they will talk to us about the Irish border, about citizens' rights, and about the Brexit bill. And not unless and until those three issues have been resolved will they even think about talking about the future. And of course, it's the talking about the future that opens the door to a GATT 24 type agreement. We also, and I think this is forgotten, have to bear in mind that once we've left, getting agreement on those three issues is far, far harder than it would be when we're inside the EU, because Article 50 gives us a bit of a let-out clause, because Article 50 lets the EU sign off a withdrawal agreement in the sort of privacy of the council building in Brussels by qualified majority. Okay, that's quite a pass. If we have left, this is going to look like a trade negotiation. That means the EU will have to sign it off by unanimity via national governments who will be exposed to pressures from their parliament. So it's perfectly conceivable that actually we'll get worse terms on those three withdrawal issues if we try and negotiate them once we've left than we will have got had we'd signed.
So it's not the process that you're saying is impossible, it's the political practicality of doing it.
No, there is a process. There is an Article 24 process which exists for pretty clearly defined circumstances. If two states have decided to agree on a free trade agreement, this will provide them a glide path from their current status towards that. But you've got to have that negotiation on the free trade agreement in process. And the EU can't start negotiating that until we've left under its own law because we're a member state, so it has to wait till we've left. And at that point, they've said they won't do it.
Yeah. Northern Ireland border, which you mentioned right at the beginning, and now, as well as Boris Johnson's interview, Laura Kuenssberg, right at the other end of the day, at the beginning of yesterday, and we started the Today programme almost right at the beginning with it, this group of MPs who have come out, including former Trade Minister Greg Hands and other people who thought about these things, who have come out and said, look, there is actually a technological solution to the Northern Ireland border. It is within sight. It doesn't depend on futuristic technology. This is the crucial point I thought he made to me. It actually could be done with existing technology. What do you make of that?
My response to that is, if you think that is true, then sign up to the backstop, because you'll never need it. If you have complete faith in that technology, what is wrong with signing up to the backstop? Because as soon as you signed up to the backstop, you introduce the technology, you never use the backstop, and everything's solved.
Yeah.
But what the EU is saying, not wholly unreasonably, is, look, this hasn't been tried on any border anywhere in the world. We're willing to believe that you might be able to do it. But actually, just in case it doesn't work, because Lord knows that we have examples in history of technology not living up to its promise, okay?
Not in this industry.
We would like, no, not in the car industry. We would like to have a fallback, and that's the backstop.
Yeah. Can I ask you, finally, before I throw it open to people, is there, in your view, a real substantive difference between the Boris Johnson approach and the Jeremy Hunt approach? When you look at what Hunt says, and he, of course, has been very much out and talking about these things, and we had him on yesterday, when you look at what he says about what he thinks is possible and about the negotiations or the renegotiations that he wants to have with the Europeans, is there anything about him that makes you think, yep, that could work?
No, I think there are slight difference of emphases between the two men, but overall, it is renegotiate the backstop and then more or less willingly, if we can't do that, contemplate a no-deal exit from the European Union. I mean, Jeremy Hunt has said he'll change the negotiating team, so he's going to take the DUP and the European Research Group with him, so I think the negotiations will probably take place in a bigger room in Brussels, but I don't think substantively they're going to be any different for that. So
but the point that he makes, and others have made, about having politicians doing the negotiating, is that they're talking about what is really realistic, and so you don't have that kind of sense of officials sorting things out between themselves. You have the politicians whose signatures would actually have to be. I mean, to you, would it make any difference to have the politicians, whoever it is, taken to Brussels so that they can do a deal face to face?
I must say, I find this really irritating and dishonest, to be honest, because politicians have run the negotiations from the get-go. Civil servants act on instructions from politicians. Ollie Robbins doesn't go over there and say, oh, I've got a wheeze for Britain, I'll tell the Prime Minister when I get home. He's told what to do by politicians, and the fact that you have people who have been in government acting as if civil servants have been going solo on this, I think is profoundly damaging, because it affects the reputation of the civil service, and I think it's just plain untrue as well.
So, say for the sake of argument, Jeremy Hunt wins for some reason. I don't know, something goes wrong with Boris Johnson's campaign. It's possible.
Might do a Today programme interview.
So he wins. So he then we don't then leave October 31st. His plan. I mean, we wouldn't say yesterday when I talked to him, we wouldn't say how long he envisaged his new set of negotiations going on. But say they lasted then into next year, with your European hat on, as it were, with your knowledge of the European Union and of the personalities and the politics impinging on them looking at us, how willing are they going to be to just carry it on?
Well, the best you're going to get from me is an informed guess. But if you want that, what I would say is I think they will be willing. Why? Because actually, in a curious way, the Europeans have finally arrived at the sort of Britain they've always wanted. We sit at the council table, we don't say very much, we don't veto anything, we don't propose anything, and yet we keep paying into the budget. I mean, what's not to like? All right? So that Britain works quite well until we get to April, May next year, because in May they are scheduled to start the voting on the medium-term financial framework. And I think at that point, the European Union is going to say to us, either you're guaranteeing to be in for this process, in which case you can sit around the table, you can negotiate, you can vote, or you need to be out. But we don't want uncertainty over that. So I think the situation changes fundamentally by the time we get to next spring. But for now, at least, for a combination of the fact that A, we're not really disrupting them, and B, the EU doesn't want to be seen to be imposing no deal on us, because they will be imposing no deal on Belgium, on the Irish, on the Dutch,
even
the French
Macron
as well.
when it comes to it.
I suspect not. I mean, you know, the Pas-de-Calais will be very, very badly affected. Whatever one interview on the Today programme might have suggested,
Yeah.
they were all ready for no deal, that everyone talks about all the time, So no, I suspect when push comes to shove, and he got his fingers burnt at the last European Council. Now, there's no doubt, I'm not saying for a moment that these people still hold on to the hope that, let's hope that the Brits stay. I think the mood has shifted quite decisively amongst the 27 about us and about what would happen if we were to stay. So they're reconciled to the fact that we're leaving, but I don't think they will necessarily push the button in October.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Let me throw it open. We've got microphones, I think, that could be brought to people who want to ask anything. So anyone who wants to is very welcome. And we've got sort of 5 minutes or so. I wanted to, if there's not an immediate question, I want to just turn more specifically to this industry and actually the European view of because, you know, as everyone in this room knows perfectly well about the potential impacts that various outcomes will have. Does that give in European councils writ large, chancelleries, parliaments, etc., does that give this industry a way of influencing what is going to happen that is real and impactful, if that's a word?
What, the sort of German car exporters line? No, I don't think. I remember talking to a German businessman over there a couple of years ago, and he said, if you want to understand our approach to Brexit, you need to think back to Crimea. I sort of looked at it, and I said, what? And he said then, it was very, very clear to us, the German industry did not want to impose sanctions on Russia. That would not have been our first preference. But that was a political decision, and we understood the political decision, so we went along with it. Brexit is like that. There are rules. And it might not be our first preference to make trade harder with the United Kingdom, but ultimately, if the politicians leading us say, these are the rules, this is the framework, we have to either do that or undermine those rules, we will go along with it.
Again, I throw it open. If anyone wants to ask anything about Anand Menon, they're very welcome. Yeah, chap right up at the end there. Hold on 1 second, we'll get a microphone to you. Here we go.
Good morning, thank you. Since you're such an expert, I wondered what you thought, just visioning for the future, if we wake up on the 1st of November and somehow we've fallen out of the EU by mistake or by default. We wake up, you're on the radio, Justin. What are you saying? What's happened? What's stopped working? Does life just carry on?
God, that is a horrible question. To be honest, I don't think it'll be Armageddon on the 1st of November, because I think both we and the European Union, separately, because it's important to say that the mitigations the EU have put in place, they haven't negotiated with us, they've put in place for their own member states, have done stuff to avoid the worst initial shocks. But I mean, just ponder this sentence. On the 1st of November, we will not know exactly and for certain under what terms we are trading with our largest trading partner. I mean, just reflect on that for a moment. It is a staggering statement. So there will be uncertainty, and there will be uncertainty that will cause some kinds of blockages at ports. I'm fairly convinced about that. There will be some goods that struggle to get through more than others, particularly those that are under quite tight regulatory regimes. And actually, for me, the interesting thing about no deal, and people who say no deal will be fine, and politicians who are aspiring to the highest office in the land who say no deal will be fine, is we are not a country that copes particularly well with crisis. Okay, public opinion tends to be very unforgiving of politicians who disrupt our day-to-day lives. Think back to Black Wednesday and what it did to the Conservatives' reputation for sound economic management. Think back to the fuel refinery protests of 2000, when nearly running out of petrol gave the Conservatives, 2 days after those protests, the only lead in public opinion they had during the course of that parliament. We are a country where 2 summers ago, KFC ran out of chicken and hundreds of people rang the police. All right? So I just wonder politically whether you can seriously imagine, if you are the Prime Minister, that takes us into a situation where at best there is significant risk of major disruption. Let's just leave it at that, okay? That you think you can win an election subsequent to that. I'm very, very doubtful about that. So I take what both these candidates are saying about no deal with a slight pinch of salt, I have to say.
But you are certain that if one thing that would be the case on November the 1st, there would be tariffs imposed by the EU. There would have to be. You don't.
Yeah, the EU imposed tariffs.
There's nothing that can stop that happening.
The one thing about which there is absolute uncertainty is what happens in Ireland. Yeah. That we don't know, and that the European Commission has steadfastly refused to say. Okay, and on one level, I suppose you might think that it makes sense for the new Prime Minister to say to the Europeans, you have a choice. You have no deal, which the Irish will hate, or you change the deal. And it might be that that proves enough to get some changes, whether cosmetic or not, I don't know, to the backstop. But yes, there will be tariffs. And actually what worries me more than anything else about no deal, the economic impact will be real and it will be significant, but the politics of no deal, what I fear in a no deal situation is whoever is Prime Minister basically uses the narrative of this is what the Europeans have done to punish us, wraps themselves in a flag, and basically we become still more anti-European. And actually that starts to corrode not just our relationship with the European Union, but broader security relationships as well. A year hence, if the Russians have intervened on the Lithuanian border, and you did a public opinion poll in this country, I suspect you'll see people saying, sod it, they do that to us. I mean, I think politically, no deal is really, really dangerous.
Yeah. Anyone else? Yes, right in the middle here. Get a microphone down, please. Here we go.
Morning. Fascinating discussion about it all. If you were to believe the media, there are no positives about coming out of Europe and of Brexit. What positives can we draw, particularly in this industry, after we leave Europe?
Well, look, I think Brexit involves a trade-off. I don't know of a serious economist who doesn't think that making trade harder with your nearest and biggest trading partner is going to have damaging economic impacts, but it's the politics you have to look to. So there will be greater scope if we leave, and we leave without being tied inside the single market, for governments to do things that they want to do rather than being bound by EU laws. I think one of the great things that's happened as a result of the referendum actually is our debate about what we've been doing wrong in our country for a long time, much of which has got nothing to do with the EU, but park that thought, has become a lot richer. We're talking about the North-South divide, intergenerational fairness. We're talking about the lack of investment in infrastructure in places outside the South-East. And I think without the shock to our political system that the referendum administered, we wouldn't be having those conversations now. So actually, in that sense, at least, in a political sense, I think the Brexit debate has been relatively liberating. Now, you have to say on the other side that there's been a lot of talk and absolutely no action. Think back to Theresa May in July 2016, who gave perhaps the best summary I've heard of what had caused Brexit and what we needed to do to fix the state of this country. She acted on none of that stuff about burning injustices, they're just about managing and so on and so forth. But there is a greater awareness of those issues, I think, now. And my hope, I suppose, if we leave, is that those are things that politicians will tackle as a priority going forward. And in that sense, that would have been an upside of Brexit.
Anyone else? Final thought? Yes, actually, there is someone right at the front. Let you have it rather than me. On the Today programme, it wouldn't be the case, of course, but yeah.
Given how boxed in the Conservative Party seem to be right now, whichever leader may take over, what would you recommend they do to try and find a solution that could be acceptable to keep the Conservative Party together, to actually get something through Parliament and something that's not just a wish list, that's also acceptable to Europe? Is there a route?
If I were an advisor to Boris Johnson, and as you can see, I got the piercing, so I didn't become a Tory at 16. That was my choice.
Not too late.
I think I would recommend, actually, as soon as he entered Downing Street, he starts planning for an election. I think the Tories cannot afford to have an election after a delay in October, because then they could be portrayed as, Mrs May all over again. As I've said before, I don't see how you win an election after no deal. That being the case, I think actually the strategy to pursue will be to go for an election in October, before the 31st of October, and go to the British people saying, give me a mandate to deliver Brexit to you, because Parliament won't do it.
We're going to come back to the election issue with Jill Rutt and Faisal Islam in the later part of the morning. But finally, then, if not an election, a referendum. Likely, and if we held it, who'd win?
There aren't the numbers in Parliament, as far as I can see, for a referendum now. And the indicative vote we had about a referendum, whenever it was closer than it should have been, because many Labour MPs abstained because they didn't want to annoy their colleagues by voting against. So I find it hard to believe. Who would win? I don't know. The polls are close. We don't know what turnout would be. What I do know, though, is if we had another referendum that voted Remain by 52-48 on a lower turnout than we had in 2016, that absolutely would not settle the question.
Yeah. On that slightly grim note, Anand Menon, Professor Anand Menon, thank you very much. It's really nice.